If someone had told me a year ago that my life would be bisected by the scent of wood smoke, I would have believed them. I lived in the forest, after all. Smoke was the smell of winter, of comfort, of the hearth that was the quiet, solitary heart of my world. I would not have believed, however, that the scent would one day mean terror, and then, impossibly, a beginning. I would not have believed it would be inextricably linked with him, with Marcus. My life before the fire was a thing of careful construction. A fortress of solitude built from stacks of books, the rhythmic tap of my keyboard, and the vast, indifferent silence of the pines. I was a writer. I lived with ghosts and shadows of my own making, and I preferred their company to that of the living. My cabin was my shell, nestled deep in the Oregon woods, miles from the nearest town. It was small, and it was enough. Then Marcus moved into the old Henderson place, a quarter-mile through the trees. He was a disruption. A discordant note in the symphony of my quiet existence. I saw him from my window, a silhouette of profound and unsettling physicality against the backdrop of the ancient forest. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with an economy of motion that spoke of discipline and strength. He was a presence, a solid, unmovable fact in my carefully curated landscape of fiction. He never smiled, not at me anyway. On the rare occasions our paths crossed on the winding dirt road, he would offer a single, sharp nod, his eyes, a startling, pale gray I could see even from a distance, never lingering. His face was a mask of hard lines and quiet severity. He looked like a man who had seen things. Things I only wrote about. I learned his name from the mailman, a garrulous man named Dave who seemed to think my isolation was a puzzle to be solved. "New fella's Marcus Thorne," he'd said, stuffing a package into my box. "Ex-army, I hear, keeps to himself." An understatement. Marcus was a black hole of sociability. He chopped wood with a terrifying, rhythmic fury, the axe rising and falling like a piston. He ran the logging trails with a punishing pace, his breath pluming in the cold air, a machine of muscle and endurance. He was everything I was not. Physical, grounded, brutally present in the world, I watched him, more than I should have. He became a character in my head, a silent protagonist whose backstory I invented on long, lonely afternoons. He was a hero, a villain, a man running from a past that haunted his every step. My fascination was a secret, a small, anxious flame I nursed in the hearth of my own chest. It was a safe distance, a story I could control. The distance was everything. It was the trees between our cabins. It was the silence between his nod and my hurried retreat. It was the chasm between his world of stark reality and my world of crafted words. I existed in the periphery of his life, a ghost in a neighboring house, and that was the only way I could manage the sheer, overwhelming fact of him. He was too much, too real. That summer was dry, unnaturally so. The air grew thick and hazy, the sun a dull, orange coin in a sky the color of old brass. The forest, usually a damp, living thing, became brittle. The scent of pine was replaced by the smell of dust and parched earth. We all felt it, a low, thrumming anxiety that settled in the bones of the mountains. The fire started on a Tuesday, a lightning strike miles to the east. At first it was just a smudge on the horizon, a distant problem. But the winds were cruel that week. They picked up, fanning the embers into a hungry, roaring beast that began to chew its way west. My routine, my armor, began to crack. I found myself at the window more than at my desk, watching the plume of smoke grow from a faint wisp into a monstrous, churning cloud that blotted out the sun. The air grew heavy, tasting of ash. The world outside my window turned a sickly, apocalyptic orange. Panic, a cold, familiar snake, began to uncoil in my stomach. The authorities issued a Level 1 evacuation notice. Be ready. I packed a small bag, my laptop, a few notebooks, a change of clothes, things, just things, but they were the things that made up my life. The notice went to Level 2, beset. The snake in my stomach was writhing now, a knot of pure dread. The distant roar was no longer distant. It was a deep, guttural growl that vibrated through the floorboards. The air was so thick with smoke it was hard to breathe. My eyes stung. I should have left, I know that, but my fortress was all I had. The idea of abandoning it to the flames felt like abandoning a part of myself. I hesitated, a fatal, foolish hesitation. The world outside exploded. A sudden, violent gust of wind brought the firestorm down the ridge with the speed of a freight train. The roar became a deafening, physical force. The light outside my window was no longer orange, it was a pulsating, furious red. I could hear the crackle and pop of ancient trees surrendering to the heat. My heart became a frantic trapped bird beating its wings against the cage of my ribs. This is it. The thought was strangely calm. This is how it ends. My front door splintered open. It didn't swing, it was obliterated, kicked in with a single brutal impact, and he was there. Marcus. He filled the doorway, a dark silhouette against the fiery hellscape. He had a wet bandana tied over his face, but his eyes were visible. They were wide, frantic, and blazing with an intensity that burned brighter than the flames. "What the hell are you still doing here?" His voice was a raw, gravelly shout, barely audible over the inferno. I couldn't answer. My throat was paralyzed, constricted by smoke and fear. I was frozen, a statue in my own living room, watching my world burn. He crossed the room in 2 strides. His hand clamped around my arm, and the contact was an electric shock. It was the first time he had ever touched me. His grip was like iron, but it wasn't cruel. It was urgent, desperate. "We have to go." Now he didn't wait for my consent. He simply pulled. He pulled me from the fire, from my home, from the life I had so carefully constructed. He dragged me out into the searing heat and the rain of embers towards his truck, which was pointed down the road, ready for escape. He literally pulled me from the fire, and in that moment the carefully maintained distance between us collapsed into nothing. It was burned away. The inside of his truck was an oasis of clean, recycled air. The roar of the fire was muffled, but the sight of it was all-consuming. The forest I loved was a wall of flame on either side of the road. Marcus drove with a focused, terrifying calm, his hands steady on the wheel, his knuckles white. I just sat there shaking, covered in soot, my lungs aching. I watched his profile, the hard line of his jaw, the way his eyes scanned the road, the fire, the mirrors. He was a soldier. This was a mission, and I was the asset he was extracting. His cabin was further up the mountain, tucked into a granite bluff that created a natural fire break. The air was clearer here, the immediate threat lessened. He pulled the truck into his garage and killed the engine. The silence that rushed in was profound, broken only by my own ragged breathing and the distant, hungry growl of the fire. He turned to me. His face was smudged with soot, his hair damp with sweat. The bandana was pulled down around his neck. For the first time I saw him up close, without the filter of my window or the distance of the road. The hard lines of his face were still there, but they were etched with exhaustion. His pale gray eyes were shot through with red. "Are you hurt?" he asked. His voice was softer now, the harshness stripped away by the adrenaline. I shook my head. I still couldn't find my voice. "Okay," he said, more to himself than to me. "Okay. Let's get you inside." His house was nothing like I had imagined. My fantasies had painted it as a Spartan military barracks. Bare walls, functional furniture. The reality was warm. There were books, hundreds of them, lining shelves that he had clearly built himself. The furniture was old, worn leather, comfortable. There was a framed photograph on the mantelpiece of a smiling older couple. His parents, I presumed. It was a home. A place of quiet refuge. It was as solitary as my own, but it didn't feel lonely. It felt peaceful. He led me to the kitchen and sat me down on a stool. He moved around the space with the same efficient grace I'd seen when he chopped wood. He filled a glass with water and pushed it into my hands. My fingers were trembling so badly I had to use both to hold it. He leaned against the counter opposite me, his arms crossed over his broad chest. He was watching me, his gaze analytical, assessing. I felt like a specimen under a microscope. "You have a burn," he said, his voice flat. He pointed to my forearm. I looked down. A red, angry welt was rising on my skin, just below the elbow. An ember must have landed there. I hadn't even felt it. Before I could protest, he was moving again. He came back with a first aid kit, opened it on the counter, and took out a tube of ointment and a clean white cloth. He pulled another stool over and sat in front of me, our knees almost touching. The space between us felt charged, electric. "Give me your arm," he said. It wasn't a request. I held it out, my muscles tense. His hand came up, and his fingers, calloused and strong, gently encircled my wrist. His thumb rested on my pulse point, and I was sure he could feel the frantic, terrified rhythm of my blood. The contact was a brand, a point of heat that had nothing to do with the burn. He cleaned the wound with a cool, damp cloth. His touch was incredibly gentle. It was a shocking contradiction to the man who had kicked my door off its hinges. He moved with a surgeon's precision, his large hands careful and steady. I watched his face, the way his brow furrowed in concentration. I saw a small, white scar that cut through his left eyebrow, a detail I'd never been close enough to notice before. I saw the weariness in the corners of his eyes, a deep, profound exhaustion that seemed to go soul-deep. My entire world had just been reduced to ash, and all I could focus on was the feeling of his thumb stroking softly against the thin skin of my wrist. It was probably unconscious, a self-soothing gesture, but it sent a tremor straight through me. My breath hitched, his eyes flicked up to meet mine. The gray was like a stormy sea, deep and unreadable. For a moment the world narrowed to the few inches between our faces. The roar of the fire, the loss of my home, it all faded into a distant hum. There was only the heat from his hand, the intensity of his gaze, and the sudden, terrifying realization that the fortress I had built was never meant to keep the world out. It was meant to keep this feeling in, this terrifying, overwhelming longing. He finished dressing the burn, his movements a little stiffer now. He didn't let go of my arm immediately. He just held it, his gaze still locked on mine. The power dynamic, the one where he was the intimidating stranger and I was the timid observer, had vanished. He had saved me, yes. But now, in the quiet of his kitchen, he looked just as lost as I felt. He looked vulnerable. "Why didn't you leave Leo?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. He knew my name. Of course he knew my name. Dave the mailman. Still, hearing it from his lips felt like another brand. "I don't know," I whispered, and it was the truth. I froze. He nodded slowly, his thumb resuming its slow, circular motion on my wrist. "Yeah," he said, his gaze dropping to my arm. "I know that feeling." He let go then, and the loss of contact was a physical ache. He stood up and went to the window, staring out at the orange glow that was consuming the forest. My forest, my home. A wave of despair washed over me, so potent it made me dizzy. I gripped the edge of the counter. "It's all gone," I said, the words hollow. "Not all of it," he said, his back still to me. "The fire break should hold here, this place will be fine, and you're safe, you're safe." The words echoed in the quiet room. He had made me safe. This man, this stranger, this antagonist from my private stories, had risked his life to run into a burning building for me. The thought was too big to comprehend. I must have made a sound, a small, choked sob, because he turned around. His face was etched with a concern that was so unexpected it stole my breath. He came back to me, hesitated for a second, and then placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. "Hey," he said softly, "it's okay, just breathe." And so I did. I sat in his kitchen in the middle of a firestorm and breathed. And for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't alone in my fear. He stood there, his hand a warm, solid weight on my shoulder, a silent anchor in the storm. The man I had watched from a distance, the man I had been afraid of, was the only thing holding me together. The power had shifted. I wasn't just the person he'd rescued. I was a person he was comforting. And in his eyes I saw a flicker of something I recognized all too well: loneliness. The strong, silent soldier was just as alone as the reclusive writer, and that realization leveled everything. The power went out an hour later. The low hum of the refrigerator died, plunging the house into a deeper, more absolute silence. The only light came from the hellish, orange glow outside the windows and the small emergency lantern Marcus had placed on the kitchen table. It cast long, dancing shadows that made the room feel like a cave, a final bastion against the end of the world. We sat at the table, the lantern between us. We hadn't spoken much. There was nothing to say. The roar of the fire was a constant, a monstrous presence that filled all the empty spaces. Marcus had made coffee on a small camp stove, and the familiar bitter scent was a small comfort, a ghost of normalcy in a world gone mad. He held his mug in both hands, staring into its dark depths as if searching for an answer. The hard mask was gone, replaced by a profound weariness. He looked older than I'd thought, not in years, but in experience. His face was a map of things I couldn't imagine. "You were in the army," I said. It wasn't a question. He looked up, his gray eyes catching the lantern light. "A long time ago," he said. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together. "Feels like another life. Is that where you learned to kick indoors?" The attempt at humor was feeble, pathetic, but it was all I had. A shadow of a smile touched his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Among other things. Mostly you learn how to wait, and how to run towards things that any sane person would be running away from." He looked out the window again. This noise, the heat, it reminds me of things I'd rather forget." It was a confession. A crack in the armor so wide I could see the vulnerable man inside. He wasn't just a stoic hero, he was a man with ghosts of his own. The character I had invented was a pale imitation of the complex, wounded person sitting across from me. "I'm sorry," I said, the words inadequate, "for bringing this to you." His head snapped back towards me, his expression sharp. Don't say that. You think I was going to sit here and watch your cabin burn with you inside it?" The intensity was back in his eyes, a flicker of the same fire that raged outside. "I see you every day. I see you at your window in your garden. I see the light on in your study late at night." My heart stopped. He sees me. The words ricocheted around the inside of my skull. He, the object of my secret observations, had been observing me right back. The power dynamic didn't just shift, it inverted, spun on its axis, and left me breathless. "You're always alone," he continued, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. "I get that, I prefer it myself, or I thought I did." He looked down at his hands, at the calluses and scars. "It's different seeing someone else be alone. It looks colder from the outside." The air in the small kitchen became thick, heavy with unspoken things. Years of solitude, of unspoken longing, of watching each other through the trees. My carefully constructed world of fiction felt flimsy compared to this raw, terrifying reality. "I was scared of you," I confessed, the words tasting like rust in my mouth. "You always seemed so angry." He let out a short, harsh laugh. "Not angry, just loud, in my own head, it's hard to turn it off." He finally met my gaze again, and his eyes were stripped bare of all pretense. They were just honest and tired and full of a deep, aching loneliness that mirrored my own. "I didn't know how to talk to you. What would I even say? Hello, neighbor I watch through the woods. Your garden looks nice." It felt creepy. "I watch you too," I admitted, my voice barely audible. "Chopping wood, running." A slow, genuine smile finally reached his eyes, transforming his face. The harsh lines softened. He suddenly looked younger, less burdened. "So we're a couple of creeps, then." The tension broke. I felt a laugh bubble up, a real one, and the sound was alien in the face of so much destruction. We were just two men trapped in a cabin, surrounded by fire, finally telling the truth. The conversation flowed after that. We talked about the books on his shelves, the stories I wrote, the places he'd been in the world that were nothing but sand and rock and danger. We talked about the quiet of the forest, the thing we had both sought out for different reasons. He sought it to escape the noise of his past, I sought it to escape the noise of the world. As he spoke, he started to move around the small space. He checked the windows, adjusted the lantern. He was a man of action, uncomfortable with stillness. I just watched him, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over me for the first time that night. My home was gone, my future was a terrifying blank, but in this small, dim room I felt safer than I had in years. He stopped in front of me, his large frame blocking the lantern light, casting him in shadow. "You should get some sleep," he said. "I'll keep watch." I shook my head. "I won't be able to sleep." "You need to." He reached out, his hand hovering in the air between us for a moment before it came to rest on my cheek. His palm was warm and rough against my skin. His thumb brushed over my cheekbone, a gesture of such profound and unexpected tenderness that it made my throat ache. "Leo," he said, his voice a low rumble. And the way he said my name, it was everything. It held all the unspoken conversations, all the watchful glances through the trees, all the shared loneliness of the past year. He leaned in slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away. I couldn't, I leaned forward, closing the small distance between us. His lips were soft, hesitant. It wasn't a kiss of passion, not of frantic desire. It was a question. It was a discovery. It was slow and careful and deeply, deeply honest. It tasted of coffee and smoke and a desperate need for connection that went beyond the physical. It was two solitudes, reaching for each other in the dark. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against mine. We stayed like that for a long moment, just breathing the same air, the lantern light flickering on our faces. The roar of the fire outside was just a background noise. The real storm was right here in this room, and it was quiet, and it was devastating, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever known. I woke to silence, a profound, unsettling silence. The roar of the fire was gone, replaced by a dead, flat quiet that felt heavier than the noise. My first thought was that I had gone deaf. My second thought was that I was alone. I was on his couch, a thick wool blanket tucked around me. I didn't remember moving from the kitchen table. He must have carried me. The thought sent a flush of heat through me, followed by a cold spike of anxiety. The lantern was off. Pale, gray morning light filtered through the smoke-stained windows. The air in the cabin was cold. Marcus was gone. Panic, swift and brutal, seized me. My heart, which had felt so calm and steady in his presence, resumed its frantic, trapped bird rhythm. I sat up, the blanket pooling around my waist. The cabin was empty. His boots were gone from by the door. His jacket was missing from its hook. He left without a word. My mind, my greatest asset and my cruelest enemy, began to spin its terrible narratives. It was a mistake. A moment of weakness brought on by adrenaline and fear. He regretted it. The cold light of day had washed away the intimacy of the firelit darkness. He woke up next to the trembling, pathetic writer he'd rescued out of pity, and he couldn't get away fast enough. The self-recrimination was a physical poison seeping into my bloodstream. I felt sick. How could I have been so stupid, to misread the situation so completely, to mistake a moment of shared trauma for something more? I stood up, my legs unsteady. I went to the window. The world outside was a monochrome nightmare. The vibrant green of the forest was gone, replaced by a uniform, desolate black. Skeletal trees stood like charcoal sentinels against a gray, smoke-choked sky. It was a landscape of death. It was how I felt inside. I saw my own cabin, or what was left of it. Just the stone chimney stack, rising like a tombstone from a bed of gray ash. Everything else, my books, my words, my life, was gone. The despair I had held at bay last night came crashing down on me, a tidal wave of grief. And this time there was no hand on my shoulder to steady me. The silence was the worst part. The old silence of my life had been a choice, a comfort. This new silence was an absence. It was shaped exactly like him. The space where he had stood was now a gaping void. The air where his voice had been was empty. The warmth of his touch had been replaced by a deep internal chill. I had to get out of there. I couldn't stay in his house, surrounded by the ghost of what I had foolishly thought was a connection. I found my soot-stained clothes from the night before, folded neatly on a chair. My wallet and keys were on top. A small, practical kindness that felt like a final, dismissive cruelty. I walked. I didn't know where I was going. My car was a melted husk of metal. The road was my only option. I walked down the mountain, through the apocalyptic landscape, each step taking me further away from his cabin, from him. Each step felt like a failure. The town was a chaotic hub of emergency services and displaced people. A kind volunteer from the Red Cross found me, wrapped me in a blanket, and gave me a cup of hot, sweet tea that I couldn't drink. They set me up in a temporary cot in the high school gymnasium, along with dozens of other hollow-eyed survivors. For 2 days I existed in a numb haze. I answered questions, filled out forms, and stared at the gymnasium ceiling. I was a ghost, haunting the edges of other people's tragedies, and through it all there was nothing, no call. No text, not that I had a phone anymore, no sign of him. The silence confirmed my worst fears. It had been a mistake. He wanted me gone. He had saved my life, and I had repaid him by forcing an unwanted, awkward intimacy upon him. The shame was a constant, bitter taste in my mouth. My old solitude returned, but it was twisted, tainted. It was no longer a peaceful fortress. It was a prison cell. And its walls were papered with the memory of his face in the lantern light, the feel of his hand on my cheek, the impossible, devastating hope of that one, single kiss. The absence of him was 1,000 times worse than the solitude I had known before. Before, I hadn't known what I was missing. Now, the lack was a phantom limb, an ache for something that had been amputated before it had ever truly formed. On the third day, they let some residents back up the mountain to assess the damage. A sheriff's deputy drove me. The devastation was even more stark in the full light of day. It was absolute. The deputy dropped me at the end of what used to be my driveway. "I'll be back in an hour," he said, his voice full of practiced pity. I stood there in the ruins of my life. There was nothing to salvage, nothing to even sift through. It was all just ash. Fine gray powder that puffed up around my feet as I walked to where my front door used to be. I sank to my knees on the foundation, the only thing left. I didn't cry. I was beyond tears. I was hollowed out, an empty vessel filled with ash and regret. I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel road. I didn't look up. It was probably the deputy coming back early. I didn't want to talk. I just wanted to be left alone with my ghosts. But the vehicle that pulled up was not a patrol car. It was his truck, the same truck he had used to pull me from the fire. My heart hammered against my ribs. A sickening mix of hope and dread churned in my stomach. I stayed where I was, my back to him, pretending I hadn't heard. Maybe he would see me and see the ruins and just leave. It would be easier. The truck door opened and closed. Footsteps crunched through the ash, coming closer. They stopped a few feet behind me, the silence stretched, thin and fragile. Leo, my name, his voice, it was a physical blow. I squeezed my eyes shut. I couldn't do this. I couldn't face the pity, the awkward apology, the final, gentle dismissal. He didn't say anything else. He just came and sat down on the foundation next to me. Not too close, but near enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body. We sat there for a long time, two silent figures in a landscape of ruin. "I'm a coward," he said finally, his voice low and rough. I opened my eyes. I turned my head to look at him. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at his hands, which were clenched into tight fists on his knees. His face was a wreck. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. The confidence, the stoicism, it was all gone. He just looked broken. "I woke up," he said, still not looking at me. "And you were there on my couch, and I panicked. I've spent the last 10 years learning how to be alone. How to not need anyone, it's safe, no one gets hurt." He finally turned to look at me, and his gray eyes were filled with a desperate, raw vulnerability that mirrored my own. "And then that night, with you, it wasn't safe. It was terrifying, and I did the only thing I know how to do. I ran. The dam inside me broke. All the fear, the shame, the loneliness of the past few days, it all came pouring out. I thought you regretted it," I whispered, the words ragged. "I thought it was pity, I thought I was a mistake." "No," he said, his voice fierce. He moved closer, closing the space between us. "God, no, Leo. It was the only thing that's felt real in years." He reached out, his hand covering mine where it rested on the cold stone. His touch was hesitant but firm. "I went to the shelter. They said you'd already been processed. I've been driving around for 2 days looking for you. I was so scared. I thought I'd lost you before I even had you." The clarifying truth of his words washed over me, cleansing the poison of my own anxieties. He wasn't running from me. He was running from the same thing I had been, the fear of connection, the terror of letting someone in. "I'm not good at this," he said, his thumb stroking the back of my hand. "Words, feelings, I'm good at building things. Fixing things, but this," he gestured to the space between us. "This I don't know how to do." "Me neither," I admitted, a watery smile touching my lips. "I just write about it. I've never actually lived it." He held my gaze, his own eyes searching mine. "Maybe we could learn," he said, "how to do it together." It wasn't a grand declaration. It wasn't a promise of forever. It was something better. It was a quiet, honest admission of fear, and a tentative, hopeful offer to face it side by side. He reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled something out. It was a key, a single, simple brass key. He pressed it into my palm and closed my fingers around it. "My cabin is still standing," he said. "There's a spare room, or just the couch if you want, but I don't want you to be in a shelter. I want you to be close. In case the fire comes back, or just in case." We both knew it had nothing to do with the fire. It was an invitation. It was an act of trust. He was giving me access not just to his home, but to his life. The life he had so fiercely guarded. He was handing me the key to his fortress. I looked down at the key in my hand, its metal cool against my skin. Then I looked at the ashes of my old life and then back at him. At this man who had pulled me from the flames and then walked back into my life through the wreckage. "Okay," I said, my voice was steady. "Okay, Marcus." And in the midst of all that destruction, surrounded by the ghosts of what used to be, something new began to build. The days that followed were a strange new kind of quiet. I moved into his spare room, a space that was as neat and orderly as the rest of his house. But slowly, my presence began to soften its edges. A book left on the nightstand, a coffee mug on the windowsill, a sweater draped over the back of a chair, small, quiet assertions of my existence within his. We learned a new rhythm, a new dance of domesticity. It was awkward at first. Two solitary planets, accustomed to their own orbits, suddenly pulled into the same gravitational field. We bumped into each other in the narrow hallway. We reached for the same coffee pot in the morning. We were clumsy. We were careful. But the clumsiness gave way to a gentle choreography. I learned that he liked his coffee black and strong. He learned that I couldn't write without absolute silence. I would sit at his kitchen table with my new laptop, a loan from the insurance company, and try to find my words again. He would disappear into his workshop for hours, the sound of sanding or sawing a distant, comforting hum. We didn't talk much about that night. We didn't have to. It was the foundation upon which this new, fragile structure was being built. Instead, we talked about small things, the progress of the fire containment lines, the stubborn persistence of a single green shoot pushing its way up through the ash in my old garden, the plot of the book I was trying to write. One morning, I woke up early before the sun. The house was still and dark. I padded into the living room and found him there, sitting in the dark, staring out the window. He wasn't looking at the ravaged landscape. He was looking at the stars, which were finally visible again through the thinning smoke. I came and sat next to him on the floor, leaning my shoulder against his. He didn't startle. It felt like he had been waiting for me. "Bad dream?" I asked softly. He shook his head. "Just a loud night in my head." He turned to look at me, his face barely visible in the starlight. "It's quieter, though. When you're here." The confession hung in the air between us, simple and profound. I had thought my presence was an intrusion on his peace. I never imagined it could be a comfort. I leaned my head against his shoulder. He wrapped an arm around me, pulling me closer. His body was a solid, warm wall against the cold of the night. We sat like that for a long time, watching the sky slowly lighten in the east, two quiet men finding solace not in solitude, but in a shared silence. The next night, I didn't go back to the spare room. After we had cleaned up from dinner, a comfortable, quiet meal, I simply followed him to his bedroom. He stopped at the door, turning to look at me, a question in his eyes. I answered it by stepping past him into the room. There was no anxiety, no fear. There was just a quiet, profound rightness to it. Sleeping in his bed with his solid presence beside me was the most peaceful rest I had ever known. The ghosts in my head were silent, chased away by the steady, even rhythm of his breathing. My life had been one of careful sentences and curated paragraphs. It was ordered, controlled, and predictable. Marcus was a plot twist I never saw coming. He was the disruption, the fire, the force of nature that had torn my narrative apart. But in the wreckage, he had helped me build something truer, something stronger. My old life was solitary. I had mistaken it for peace. This new life was shared, and for the first time I understood what it meant to be home. Home wasn't a place. It wasn't a cabin built of wood and stone. It was the quiet space beside another person. It was the steady hand that reached for yours in the dark. It was the comfort of knowing that even if the fires came again, you wouldn't have to face them alone. He didn't just pull me from a fire. He pulled me into a life I never knew I was brave enough to live, and that changed everything.